Within 24 hours, the Strait of Hormuz was closed, declared open, then closed again. Oil prices had plunged 11% on the reopening news. Iranian gunboats opened fire on commercial shipping. By the time markets reopened the next trading day, prices were climbing right back by nearly 7%. This is the most strategically important waterway on Earth, and for 100 days, no one has been able to reliably say whether it's open. And whether the strait is open or closed on the day you watch this, the damage from what's already happened is propagating through the global economy. And most of it's still weeks, months, and in some cases, quarters away from landing. This is what the cascade actually looks like. Start with what the strait carries, not oil, everything. 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products per day, a fifth of the world's supply. Crude oil is the input cost for almost everything manufactured, transported, or grown. This is where the cost is set. Around 80 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year, almost entirely from Qatar, shipped under long-term contracts to Japan, South Korea, India, and Pakistan. There is no spot market substitute at scale. The ammonia and urea that determine whether next season's crops get planted in India and Pakistan and drive up the cost of planting them in Brazil and the United States. That's up to 30% of the world's traded fertilizer. Nearly 17 million tons of polyolefins, the raw material inside almost every piece of packaging. When it stops moving, the shortage does not show up at the chemical plant. It shows up on the production line of every food manufacturer that needs a container. Japan and South Korea receive the majority of their energy imports through the Strait of Hormuz. China gets roughly a third of its crude. Europe gets almost 10% of its LNG from Qatar alone. The financial instruments written against this flow, loans, insurance, trading positions, stack up between $1 and $3 trillion. On February 28th, the US and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury. Iran's supreme leader and roughly 30 senior officials are killed in the opening strikes. Iran retaliates across the region. The IRGC begins shutting down the strait through physical threats. 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships, sea mines, and radio warnings. But the 21-mile strait is not physically sealed. It is too wide for that. The closure happens somewhere else, Lloyd's of London. The marine war risk insurance market is dominated by a handful of syndicates in the City of London. War risk coverage is a practical necessity for Gulf transit. In 2019, a smaller Gulf incident sent premiums tenfold above peacetime levels. This time, they went from 10 to 15 times higher than that, almost overnight. A single transit for a large tanker went from costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to several million. For many owners, coverage didn't disappear on paper, but the price rose high enough that the effect was the same. Without insurance, cargo owners do not load ships. Without cargo, ships do not sail. Tanker traffic collapses 90% in the first week. That is layer 1 of the cascade, the on-off switch. Layer 2 hits within days. Across 102 Gulf facilities, refineries, chemical plants, port terminals, LNG exporters, operations start grinding to a halt. Over $21 billion in direct revenue at risk, nearly 100,000 jobs exposed. This is the smallest layer of damage by a wide margin, because layer 3 is what happens when the supply stops arriving. Japanese refiners burning through reserves, South Korean petrochemical plants, the ones that turn Middle Eastern oil into the plastic in your phone, watching their feedstock dry up. Pakistan's grid beginning to ration. Bangladesh, where 2/3 of electricity comes from gas, watching its margin disappear. And these aren't financial exposures anymore. This is 20 million people in Karachi, a city where summer hits 45 degrees Celsius. This is hospitals switching to diesel generators. Diesel that also comes through Hormuz on the same ships from the same suppliers. This is the part of the cascade that turns a commodity story into a humanitarian one. And then layer 4, the part most companies never see coming. Volkswagen, BMW, Airbus, Boeing, none of them buy directly from the Gulf, but the aluminum billet and primary metal in their aircraft and vehicles flows from smelters like EGA in Abu Dhabi and Alba in Bahrain. Aerospace-grade aluminum requires certifications that take years to replicate. There is no substitution path in weeks. The polyolefins from Jubail and Ruways that become plastic packaging, the urea that becomes fertilizer for wheat in India and corn in the United States, the ammonia that becomes almost every nitrogen chemical input in modern agriculture. When those buffers deplete, the cost shock reaches the shelf. And we are at day 100. And sitting above everything, a fifth layer. Dozens of financial entities with positions priced against the risk without moving a single molecule. Vitol, Trafigura, and Glencore collectively move a fifth of the world's daily oil supply and hold billions in Gulf cargoes that can no longer move. The banks that financed those tankers now hold collateral trapped in a war zone, and the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf, built dollar by dollar on oil moving through the Strait, are spending those savings to survive its closure. Across all 5 layers, between $1 and $3 trillion in estimated economic damage. This is the map. This is what happens when a 21-mile waterway closes. Every time Iran declares the strait open or closed, oil moves. When Trump announces a deal is closed, markets rally. When Iran fires on a tanker, they sell off. This volatility is real. It is also mostly irrelevant to the damage, because whether the strait is open today does not undo what has already happened. Lloyd's has not restored coverage to pre-crisis levels. Insurers do not reprice risk on the day of an announcement. They reprice when conditions have been stable long enough that the math supports it. Weeks, not hours. And every time the strait closes again, that clock resets. At its peak, between 1,500 and 2,000 vessels were holding positions inside the Persian Gulf, unable to transit to open waters. Clearing that backlog, once transit is reliably possible, takes months, not weeks. Iran still demands sanctions relief, frozen asset release, and reparations. The US still demands the end of uranium enrichment entirely. Every deal is close announcement is followed by another closure, another blockade update, another round of attacks. And a ceasefire is not a peace agreement. It is a pause, and every pause so far has ended. Fertilizer orders not placed during the spring planting window cannot be retroactively filled. Wheat and rice yields in India, Pakistan, Egypt, and sub-Saharan Africa for the 2026 harvest are already affected. Pharmaceutical ingredient buffers that depleted during the 100-day disruption do not refill overnight. India supplies active pharmaceutical ingredients to more than 200 locations with no strategic global reserve. Paracetamol, metformin, amoxicillin. Restocking takes up to months. Marine insurance premiums, once ratcheted up, historically do not return to prior levels for years. The 2019 Gulf tanker incident led to elevated premiums that never fully normalized. This crisis was larger by orders of magnitude. European fuel pump prices had nearly recovered from the Russia-Ukraine shock. The Iran strikes erased that recovery almost overnight. They come down slowly when they come down at all. Roughly 2,000 seafarers remain stranded on ships in the Gulf. They cannot simply leave, because no relief captain will board in a war zone. This is the thing about chokepoint crises in the modern economy. The closure is fast, the reopening is slow, contested, and frequently reversed. The damage between those moments compounds for months after the political situation has changed. And this was one of 11 such chokepoints on Earth. The Strait of Malacca carries roughly 25% of all traded goods. The Suez Canal handles around 15% of global trade. Bab el-Mandeb has been under sporadic attack for over 2 years. The Panama Canal spent over a year rationing transits due to drought, and the same conditions are forecast to return. The Turkish Straits are the only maritime exit from the Black Sea, carrying 20% of the world's wheat exports. None of them has real redundancy. None of them is fully mapped at the level required to understand what actually breaks when they close, because the exposure isn't at your direct supplier, it's at their supplier, and the one below that, and the one below that. And most of the economy doesn't know who those companies are until a crisis forces the question. That is the lesson Hormuz just delivered. Not that a choke point can close, we knew that. The lesson is how fast a closure translates into global disruption. When commercial infrastructure, insurance, finance, underwriting turns a physical event into a system-wide stoppage, and how slowly, messily, and with how many false starts the stoppage unwinds once it begins. The Strait will eventually reopen for good, but none of that changes what already happened or what's still coming. The closure was a 21-mile problem. The damage is a global one, and that is the gap every choke point on Earth is now measured by.